morning. My name is Gail Monroe. Today I am here on behalf of the 9/11 Remembrance Anchor Date Working Group. Welcome, thank you for coming. Today we are here to hear the recollections of someone who had a very special position on 9/11/2001, Captain Patrick Burns, who today we know as our Deputy Director, but 20 years ago he was in a very unique position as the Navy's liaison to the city of New York, and personally witnessed many events that he is going to share with us today. Captain Patrick, would you like to?
Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate you all coming here to hear my remembrances of 9/11. I'm sure you all have your own. I forced myself to do this. I'll get it out early. Yeah. I believe in the mission of this place, and history, I've learned, is really dependent on primary source materials. And my dad was a World War II Marine captain and would never talk about it. And I had the honor of meeting Captain Ann Stenzel's father, who was a quarterdeck watch on the USS Tennessee during Pearl Harbor, and he wouldn't talk about it at all. In fact, President Bush I asked him to come to the 50th at Pearl Harbor, and he said no. As a lieutenant, I thought that was outrageous. Today, I get it. But I think I owe it to history and primary source materials and you and myself to share these things. I've spoken twice, but in a much more controlled environment. Last year, or 2 years ago, Student Veterans of America had Senator Duckworth and myself talk about leadership lessons. That's a lot easier than talking about personal remembrances. And then Columbia University had me talk about command and control, which is a lot easier to talk about than personal experiences. So this is the first time I've just spoken about my experiences. And to make it a little bit easier and more coherent, I'm going to focus on lessons learned. So it's not just the ramblings of some old guy, but maybe something you can take home with you. Note, this is New York City. The F word is used loosely. Sorry if that offends people. In New York, that's kind of like saying good morning. The original article, which most of this is based on, was the first time I ever met NHHC face-to-face. The Naval History Center sent a commander up from the reserve unit, which is now under threat, to do an oral history. And I pulled that oral history when I wrote an article for Notre Dame Magazine in 2007, and I checked with everybody I mentioned in the article if I had it accurately, and they said yes. So given all of that, we'll just start. Let's see. On the morning of September 11, 2001, I was in Norfolk, Virginia, office of Commodore Scott Jones, when someone called in and said, "Hey, you're from New York, a plane hit the World Trade Center." We ran to the TV. The Commodore and I had recently worked on a joint flyover as part of the Presidential Naval Review held on the Hudson River on July 4th, 2000. We knew the traffic patterns of Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK, and how careful the FAA and strict the FAA was. This didn't seem possible. The television images showed us just how terribly wrong things were. A few days before the attack, I had been in my office at the Coast Guard building in Battery Park at the tip of Manhattan. You could see both towers from the World Trade Center a few hundred yards away from my third floor windows. I had been working for 6 years in New York as a director of fleet support for the Navy, a civilian position that works closely with the mayor's office, New York City Police and fire departments, the FBI, FEMA, Customs and Service, the Coast Guard, as well as 60 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and regulatory and nonprofit agencies, and about 120 vendors throughout New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So my office coordinated Navy's major events in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut as one of their duties. I reported to Norfolk Naval Base on September 10th to meet my 2-week Naval Reserve obligations. Since Commodore Jones and I had worked together in New York for over a year on the President's Naval Review, he wanted me to come support his command in Norfolk. So, Now, a moment after getting to the TV, my cell phone rang. It was the Deputy Mayor of New York City, Deputy Mayor Rudy Washington. Quote, "Pat, where are you?" he asked. I said, "Norfolk." He said, "I need you here. I need that hospital ship." He was referring to the USNS Comfort, which he had toured a few months earlier during the port visit to New York. After I hung up, Commodore Jones told me that the Comfort was going to New York. I needed to be there too. Then the second plane hit the World Trade Center. My cell phone rang again. It was Lieutenant Commander Steve Estrada yelling into the phone, "A fucking plane just flew over me and hit the South Tower." I blurted out, "Because we're being fucking attacked." It was the first time anyone in the room had verbalized what we all knew. Master Chief Don Wesley and Master Chief Bill Renane were in Norfolk with me. Master Chief Renane's wife worked in the U.S. Customs House 6 World Trade Center. I'll never forget the look on his face, wondering if his wife was all right. Master Chief Wesley told me to go. They would catch up later. I then remember my brother was supposed to be in New York for meetings with Kenner Fitzgerald on the top 20 floors of the World Trade Center. I'll be better when I get on a roll. My phone rang again. It was Lieutenant Keith Davids, the Flag Lieutenant for Admiral Robert J. Natter, the Commander of U.S. Fleet Forces Command. Lieutenant Davids told me that Rudy Washington, the Deputy Mayor of New York, had called Admiral Natter and asked for help. The USS George Washington and her battle group were already at sea conducting exercises, so Admiral Natter sent them north. The USNS Comfort was being prepared. The USS Baton and Shreveport were available if needed. Air cover was already up from Navy jets out of Naval Air Station Oceana. There was a debate to fly me up or drive. Since all the planes had been ordered down, I left Commodore Jones and jumped in my car. Still receiving a steady stream of phone calls, the Deputy Mayor called me again. Excuse me. I had just left the base and pulled over on the side of the street so I could hear better. It was a beautiful day, sunny and crystal clear, a calm breeze. I was staring at a man in front of his yard on his hands and knees, tending to his picture-perfect flower beds, while the Deputy Mayor was yelling to me over the phone and the sirens through my cell phone into my right ear. "Pat," he was saying, "there were people jumping out of the towers." Then he'd ask about the status of the Comfort, the battle group, the Navy jets, because he'd been talking to Keith Davids. Soon he would come back to the horror of it. "It's raining bodies. We had to pull back. They just keep jumping." I told him I'm on my way. I hung up and looked at the man enjoying his garden. He had no idea the world was changing. Lesson learned. Soft power exercises and personal relationships matter. Fleet Weeks, op sales, United Nations 50th, Standing Forces, NATO, Atlantic, the President's International Naval Review. These soft power exercises are critical for relationship building and exercising a team. Most of the team that responded on 9/11 had been working together on Navy events for 7 years, and everyone knew everyone. Trust is key. Knowing your teammates and their capabilities is absolutely key. New York City closed. I drove north. There were no cars on the road, no people in the streets, nothing. I drove more than 90 miles per hour on the way. It truly seemed as if the world had ended. Then the phone would ring and I would have another horrific conversation, then nothing. One call came from Omar Alvarez, the Deputy Mayor's assistant. "Pat, the deputy wants to know if the military has 20,000 body bags. The city only has 6,000. I said, "I'll check." He said, "The city morgue is full. Do you have any ideas?" I said, "What about the Chelsea ice rinks?" He hung up. Senator Jerry Kane, Assistant to Police Commissioner Bernard Carrick, called wanting an update on what the Navy was doing. I got him up to date and told him Lieutenant Commander Steve Estrada, Commander Carlos Del Toro were running the Navy office in Battery Park until I got there from Norfolk. Commander Del Toro is now the Secretary of the Navy. Del Toro, he was in New York City working on the commissioning of his ship USS Bulkley DDG-68. Bernard Carrick's assistant, Sergeant Kane, said, "Well, hurry the fuck up, you hump," and hung up the phone. And that is a term of endearment in New York. in NYPD. So if you ever go to New York, that means they like you. The calls kept coming, one from Master Chief Wesley, who told me Master Chief Murnane had found his wife. I was relieved. I had not heard from my brother. Admiral Paget called and asked how I was doing. That helped. I received calls from Coast Guard Captain Bob Romanowski at the White House. He said Admiral Bennis, the U.S. Coast Guard Admiral of New York, suggested I call him to find out what the Navy was doing. I realized I'm now briefing somebody in the White House Situation Room. I briefed him everything I knew and suggested he call Lieutenant Keith Davis at U.S. Fleet Forces Command and gave him his number. Approaching New York on the New Jersey Turnpike, I learned New York City was literally closed. I was in uniform and the police let me through. I drove by the long lines of waiting cars and saw the blank stares on the people's faces. As I drove over the bridge from New Jersey to Staten Island, I saw the skyline for the first time. It looked raped, and I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I drove across Staten Island, no traffic, no cars, no people out and about. I pulled into Coast Guard Activity New York headquarters, where I found Admiral Bennis, the Coast Guard captain of the Port of New York and the incident commander for a tragedy such as this. Lesson learned: when you're in uniform, all eyes are on you. When your uniform will open doors, on 9/11, police would pull me over and then escort me. The police in New Jersey let me through to New York. Although with opening doors comes an expectation of leadership and honor, courage, and commitment, when you wear the uniform, you better be ready to stand up and meet the public's expectations. If you don't, there is no backup plan. A friend and a mentor, Admiral Bennis and his wife, Gloria, had helped me through my father's battle with cancer, and now he was fighting cancer himself, a battle he lost 23 months after 9/11. He greeted me with a handshake, a hug, a heavy dose of sarcasm. "Glad you could make it," he said. I said, "You look like hell." We both laughed the way you do when you're trying to keep it together. He told me he had left D.C. with the Pentagon on fire and drove home to New York to see this. He asked if Captain Ski had reached me from the White House. I said yes. That was the first time of many times I would experience the look that said, "Thank God you're alive." That's another one I can take off my list. But no one ever actually asked that question. No one ever asked if they knew someone was dead or alive. It was not talked about in the command center. These were unwritten rules. Even in the command center of Manhattan at Pier 92, agencies would simply post lists of the dead. People would come up and read them and walk away. We went into Coast Guard conference room for an update. Admiral Bennis had closed the Port of New York. The Coast Guard had just evacuated more than 500,000 people from Manhattan Island. Having no idea if the attacks were over, the exodus was one of the most amazing feats of 9/11. The deputy mayor had ordered the bridges and tunnels closed, fearing they would be blown up when full of thousands of people fleeing. A few years later, I was at the Imperial War Museum in London, and the curator stated that the largest wartime evacuation in history was the British evacuation from Dunkirk. Got it. Very different situations, but I couldn't help myself. I told him that was no longer the case. So this is, the Coast Guard has 18 cameras around New York Harbor. So everything on that day in the harbor is videotaped. And this is just a shot of an evacuation. That's a Holland Tunnel air exhaust, that big building in the center. People were orderly, 500,000 people. After the brief, Admiral Bennis arranged, lesson learned. Classified material and security clearance stopped communications. During the incident commander's brief, numerous law enforcement agencies were told to leave. That didn't go over well, and this hampered a lot of communications and operations. A lot of that's been fixed since 9/11, but some of it has not. After the brief, Admiral Bennis arranged for the Coast Guard boat to take me to my office in Manhattan, just south of the World Trade Center. The U.S. Navy had office space in the Coast Guard building in Battery Park at the tip of Manhattan. The power grid for the lower portion of Manhattan was down, but the Coast Guard building was on a different power grid and had lights, computers, phones, and water. As I sat in the small boat and headed to Manhattan, All I could do was stare at the plumes of smoke rising in the air above what used to be the World Trade Center. So, we disembarked at the finger piers behind the building, and I walked to my office, where I found Commander Del Toro, Lieutenant Commander Estrada, and Warrant Officer Frank Indovino. I called the deputy mayor, who said he would arrive out front in a few minutes. From my office, you could see a silent city covered in inches of gray pulverized concrete and debris. The newsstands, the hot dog stands, the cars, the benches, everything was abandoned and as people fled. I thought of Pompeii, and after the volcanic ash settled, Commander Del Toro debriefed me and left for his ship and other duties. On to ground zero. Lieutenant Commander Estrada, Warrant Officer Frank Indovino, and I went and met the deputy mayor, his assistant Omar Alvarez. He's the one facing you in that picture. And Clarice Joins, the deputy commissioner of the mayor's office of Veterans Affairs. The building had blood on the front door and cracks in the safety glass from people that had tried to kick their way in to the building as they fled the debris cloud from the collapsing World Trade Center. We walked across the silent Battery Park and up West Street. The debris field kept growing in size and magnitude. I counted 17 smashed ambulances as I walked into ground zero. We passed a airplane tire and part of its landing gear. Omar mentioned that a decapitated body had been next to the tire earlier, but someone had moved it. I didn't respond. We continued into ground zero and up onto the pile. Workers were pulling hotel laundry baskets up and over the maze of steel and concrete and vehicles. The deputy mayor said, "Don't look in there." So of course I did. They were transporting remains to the morgue. With the smoke and steam and gases, you could hear but not see Navy jets thundering overhead. I finished a bottle of water that someone had given me, and I was looking around for a garbage can. I was standing on top of millions of tons of debris looking for a garbage can. I realized then that my mind was not taking all this in, and I needed to focus on my job. Lesson learned. Training is everything. Trust your training. Focus on the job at hand. If you are not thinking clearly, stop and pull yourself together, or tell your teammates and get out of the chain of command. Bad example. A senior Naval Coast Guard officer who remained nameless in the Coast Guard building in Battery Park locked the doors to the building and would not let fleeing people in get away from the debris cloud. Admiral Bennis removed him and said, "We're in the business of saving lives, not buildings." Experience matters. After I left Notre Dame in 1986, I ended up in the Iran-Iraq War as part of Operation Praying Mantis. I learned then to focus on my job and trust my training. I had the same reaction to the attacks on New York, but there was a big difference. I always believed I would be doing these things far from my country, but in far-off places. I didn't think I'd be responding to attacks on my home, the place I went for free concerts in the summer and Christmas shopping in December, the place I met friends for lunch during work and drinks after work, the place I went jogging. The World Trade Center complex and the surrounding area was the lifeblood of Lower Manhattan and was much a part of my life as well. It was not just two office towers. Lessons learned, experience is priceless. I was standing on a debris mound near what was Liberty Street and West Side Highway with the deputy mayor. We were looking at the long lines of people forming bucket brigades. They seemed to stretch on forever and then disappear into the debris and smoke. Someone asked cynically, "Where is God in this hell?" No one responded. But I looked around at these long lines of people in these bucket brigades, and I thought, right there, God's right there, can't you see it? The response was simply amazing. Everyone in the city, trained, untrained, they just showed up to help. Sometimes to the demise of the efforts, but they showed up to help. A horn would sound and hope would shoot through you. A horn meant someone thought they'd heard a trapped victim. Everyone would be silent for nothing. it became very clear as time went on that you learned to hate that sound because it never seemed to produce any people and anyone saved. Later we found out the first 3 people saved were the last 3 people saved. We made our way over to the Office of Emergency Management Forward Command Center, where Tim Brown and Calvin Drayton were coordinating the response efforts. They eventually had to be carried out a few days later, suffering from exhaustion and sleep deprivation. All involved were doing everything possible under impossible conditions. The deputy mayor finished his work at the OEM Forward Command Center. I talked to Brown and Drayton about logistics and the need for support from the USNS Comfort and the U.S. Navy ships. They needed food, clothes, shelter, medical care for workers. As far as the number of injured, it was already becoming clear that if you were either in the kill zone or you were not in the kill zone. Those in the kill zone were gone. The deputy mayor said they're just gone. I turned to Clarice Joines, a former Marine, unflappable woman from Queens, who's one of my best friends, and she looked at me and said, "Gone, you saw, what they've been finding, basically parts." Lessons learned: stand your watch and pace yourself. They tell you this in the military, and I think these lessons learned are good for the civilians in the room too, who are writing histories of the military and need to understand the mindset that they're writing about. This is a marathon, not a sprint, right? Tim and Calvin should have followed the plan and trusted their training. If they're taking you out on a stretcher and you're not going to be any good to anyone. They're great Americans, I like them, they're good friends, but the lesson learned is clear. Pace yourself, stay in the fight, follow the plan. There's a reason they were supposed to be 12 on, 12 off, right? Know your team, trust them. Fraud and cons, even in a disaster, exist. They asked me who this guy was in an 06 uniform, flight jacket, seal pin, like wandering around the command center. And I went up to him like, "Who are you?" He couldn't answer that question. So I'm like, "Oh well." Then he tried to get aggressive with me, and then the police took him away. Never found out who it was. For Flight 800, we had a fake LSO, landing signal officer, show up and actually try to perform the job. And when the helicopter landed, the guys got out of the helicopter and started screaming at him. He was taken away by the police. So, even in a disaster, you have to be on your toes and know what's going on. Let's see, carrying the flag. It's me a few pounds later, Deputy Mayor and Lieutenant Commander Estrada. We made our way back to City Hall, where we ran into the mayor's assistant, Matt Mahoney. He said the mayor wanted to hang the American flag to help raise morale. Someone had produced the City Hall's huge American flag. The deputy mayor, Lieutenant Commander Estrada, Warrant Officer Indovino, Omar Alvarez, Clarice Joines, and I carried the flag back to Ground Zero and decided best place to hang it would be off the 20th story of the World Financial Center across the street from the World Trade Center site. It took 5 of us to carry the flag up 20 flights of stairs using flashlights and choking on the dust. We made our way through the maze of office cubicles, all covered in the same pulverized gray debris and that blanketed lower Manhattan. Because all the buildings around the site, all their windows were blown out from the force of the explosion, right? So all the buildings were then infused with all the dust and debris. We made our way through the maze of office cubicles, still covered in the same pulverized gray debris that blanketed lower Manhattan. We climbed through one of the shattered windows out onto the ledge. The 5 of us tied up the flag. As the winds blew, chunks of glass would rain down on us from smashed windows on the 40 stories above us. I kept looking up, wondering if this was such a good idea. Then I turned and looked down, and that's not from that day, but it's just a representative picture. From 20 stories up, the sight of Ground Zero smoldering just stopped me for a moment. But just then, a badly damaged walkway across from the World Financial Center that goes across 12th Street pulled away from the building and crashed on the West Side Highway. The firefighters and their bullhorns yelled to evacuate the building because she was coming down. We ran down 20 flights of stairs and regrouped outside. The building never came down, but nobody was sure if all the buildings around the 14-acre site were safe or not, right? What people don't know, and it's not in my article and stuff, is I think is a 6.2 or something earthquake when the buildings came down. So they were not letting anyone in any of the buildings in Lower Manhattan. That's the force that those buildings came down. The World Financial Center building did not come down, but when we looked up, we realized no one had unfurled the flag before we fled. We made the way back to City Hall. The fire department went up and unfurled the flag later. Lesson learned, sometimes you're not meant to be the hero, and that's just fine. The firemen who unfurled the flag that day ended up in that iconic photo, and that is probably how it should be. President Truman, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. The deputy mayor went to the temporary City Hall offices in the police academy on 26th Street. Clarice Joyce and I walked in dead silence back to my office in Battery Park. When we arrived, the deputy mayor called and asked me to come to the police academy. The fighting had already started. The arguments centered on whether the city could request specific assets such as the USNS Comfort, or whether the city could only request capabilities from FEMA, and FEMA would decide what assets would be sent. At the end of the day, I'll spare you the long conversations, the USNS Comfort was ordered to New York City. Lessons learned, support your gaining command. Now that I'm retired, I will tell you something, some of the things I didn't put in any of my remembrances. The NEPLOs, the Navy Emergency Preparedness Liaison Officers, I'd worked in New York for 7 years. I'd never seen them. We were doing national security events. So on 9/11, they show up, they're supposed to be in charge, they're supposed to be doing a lot of the work I was doing. They had no clue, right? That has been taken on by the reserves, as a matter of fact, and fixed. But support your gaining command, build a relationship with your gaining command and other associated commands. Train where you work and fight. Local knowledge is king. And I'll say, I don't have any intel. I wasn't part of the Comfort going back up for COVID. But as soon as they announced they were putting the Comfort in the same pier that we did on 9/11, I said, that's not going to work. Most of the sick people are in Brooklyn. Why aren't they putting it on the new Brooklyn pier for the Queen Mary? That's where the ambulance would have a short run to the, local knowledge is, I don't know who made that decision, but when no one's showing up at the Comfort in the middle of the COVID crisis, it's because the ambulance drivers in Brooklyn and Queens are not coming through the Midtown Tunnel or, the Triborough Bridge, all the way across Manhattan to a pier to go through massive security to get to the Comfort. Local knowledge is king. If they wanted that to be an effective mission, they needed to put that ship in Brooklyn. While at the police academy, I ran into Richie Rotans, one of the deputies at the Office of Emergency Management. Richie has 12 children. He told me he had been in the Office of Emergency Management Forward Command Center in the towers, and they had to evacuate by running across the World Trade Center plaza as they dodged falling bodies. They ran to the OEM Main Command Center on Tower 7 on the 15th floor. Then it too was evacuated, and it came down almost an hour after Towers 1 and 2. I don't know, most people forget the 47-story Tower 7 came down about an hour later. It blew up from underneath, right? Rotan said he was trying to drag 2 ladies with him as he left. One made it, one did not. He was blinded by all the debris and knocked down. He said he was crawling along the sidewalk to get far away as possible. 2 guys found him and took him to triage. Firemen also. This sent shivers down my spine. But in the true New York fashion, you can't let that be known. So I said, quote, "Of course this happened to you. You have so many kids. I'd be shocked if it wasn't your son saving you." He laughed and told me to go to hell, or words to that effect. I left the police academy exhausted and a little less idealistic. I started driving down the West Side Highway. People on either side of the highway were cheering and holding signs that read heroes and I felt a bit ashamed. like I was stealing somebody else's parade. I hadn't run into a burning skyscraper. I hadn't evacuated Manhattan. I was alive and well, and I slept Wednesday night. Lessons learned, survivor guilt. What I just described in my article that I wrote in 2007, without knowing it, is called survivor guilt. If you have deployed and lost people and you feel survivor guilt, you need to do yourself a huge favor and talk to somebody. Survivor guilt is a real thing. Thursday the 13th, things took a turn for the better. My brother called. He had stayed in Colorado for Monday Night Football and had moved his meeting at the 102nd floor of the World Trade Center tower back to the afternoon on the 11th. He was stuck in Colorado. I couldn't believe it. No, Cantor Fitzgerald was on the top floors of the World Trade Center Tower 2. They lost over 700 people, more than FDNY and NYPD combined. Only 5 or 6 of the entire firm survived. So many of the senior Cantor Fitzgerald people supported the Intrepid Museum and Fleet Week, New York. They would take us out during Fleet Week, and they're all gone. All right. Master Chief Wesley, Master Chief Murnane, and I met Commander Ralph Jones. He headed up the USNS Comfort's advance team. By now it was pouring rain, and we walked to Ground Zero to assess the situation. Thousands of cops and firemen and volunteers were working, eating, and sleeping in the rain-soaked mix of pulverized concrete, mud, garbage, debris, and 3,000 people, and whatever else stirred up in that slop, including cobalt, cesium from doctors' offices and dental offices and x-ray machines. It was a mess. Commander Jones looked at me and said, "I wasn't sure we needed to be here." That's the Comfort. "I had worked the Mexico City earthquake and other disasters, but I'm really glad we're here now that I see this." So, I have literally thousands of photos people donated to me or gave me. A lot of them were taken by the Coast Guard petty officers from public affairs. The first 48 photos allowed to be released to the public officially came from the Coast Guard. Their offices were one floor down from me in the Battery Park building, so they literally grabbed their cameras and ran in. On Friday, we established a boat service between Pier 92, the USNS Comfort, and Ground Zero, and began ferrying rescue workers, National Guardsmen, firefighters, police officers to the Comfort for food, clothes, shelter, medical attention, or a psychologist, a priest, a rabbi, or a place to sleep. The USNS Comfort did much more than they'll ever get credit for. Lesson learned, USNS Comfort, presence is important. Even if they did nothing, just showing up was important. Food from the Comfort served the first 3 days at Ground Zero. People were knocked off their feet, right? They weren't thinking clearly. We talked about that earlier. And the chief surgeon from the Comfort would go to these meetings and say, "Okay, why don't we set a perimeter around the site and keep all the volunteer food out, and we'll load up your trucks and we'll put a date and a time on all the food." And then, right, because people were starting to get sick at Ground Zero. You didn't know if that person who donated a tuna fish sandwich 3 days ago or now. It was becoming a real problem. So just having somebody outside of their present was important. Return to normal as quickly as possible. Commander Chris Peterschmidt, XO of the USS Cole's advice to me when the Cole was attacked. They made him put out a plan of the day. They kept bugging him, and he's like, "Why? My ship is a disaster. What?" They're like, "Please put out a plan of the day." He put out a plan of the day. It was about a quarter of a page. The crew grabbed it. They want normalcy. You want to return to normalcy as quickly as possible. Right? More of the story. The Comfort After Action report stated, "This is the first time the hospital ship has been involved and taken an active role in federal response plan. As the state of the world changes, it would be beneficial for our military to emphasize and understand our role in the federal emergency response plan. The professionalism and can-do attitude of the crew ensured that the mission was a resounding success. Many thanks to those who supported the comfort in New York during this devastating experience. Lessons learned. Posse Comitatus was killed by Admiral Natter. He chose to send the planes in the battle group and the comfort. All right, Posse Comitatus Act is a United States federal law signed on June 18th, 1878 by President Rutherford B. Hayes. The purpose of the act, in concert with the Insurrection Act of 1807, is to limit the power of the federal government in using federal military personnel to enforce domestic policies of the United States. It's basically meant to get Union troops out of the South. Admiral Natter took action, and he took a chance. Lesson learned, just do the right thing. The rumor is, I have no proof, that it was the president who stood up and said he took action, stop this conversation. And ever since then, we have a disaster. Where's the comfort, right? It has completely changed America's emergency response. Flags of Posse Comitatus visit. Flags for the POTUS visit. The president came to Ground Zero. It was a great moment, but I'd never seen Secret Service sweat until that day. They had been informed that the underground fires from all the jet fuel were still burning and spreading, and the city engineers believed they had picked a safe location for the president to stand and not be eaten up by a fire coming through a sinkhole. The underground fires spread till September 28th and then started to recede. So I don't know, this was my flag when President Bush showed it. They handed out a bunch of flags, and I just found this the other day getting ready for this. So, I'd like you to tell about the amazing job Mayor Rudy Giuliani did. He held 4, 5, 6 meetings a day with more than 100 agencies and addressed all their concerns. He was decisive and on top of the situation. He escorted every family member who wanted to visit Ground Zero to Ground Zero. And he used, I used to grade mass conflagration drills when I was chief engineer at Fleet Training Group, and I'd give him an A for the Ground Zero attacks. By the way, all the families were transported by Navy transport from the Comfort down to Ground Zero and back. Lessons learned, training. Admiral Bennis, New York City Coast Guard, New York, stated to me at Ground Zero, we were standing there one day, and he said, "This would have been so much harder if it wasn't for all your stupid Navy events." We both laughed, but it was true. The deputy mayor conducted red teaming for the President's International Naval Review, for Fleet Weeks, for all those events. The city took the opportunity to use those events to train. And Admiral Bennis was correct as the incident commander that if it wasn't for the Navy's events, we would not have been trained up as well as we were. I wish I could convey to you the strength I saw on a daily basis, the genuine care and concern, the openness in giving. The USNS Comfort shuttle was the fastest, safest, least intrusive way for people to go to Ground Zero. It became the VIP and family member shuttle in addition to its regular duties. The strength of the family members as they faced Ground Zero and the generosity of the athletes, singers, movie stars, and elected officials gave me a renewed faith in our country and the people in general. The deputy mayor was exhausted one day, and he asked if I would take Reggie Jackson to Ground Zero for him. I was happy to help. I didn't know what to expect, but Reggie Jackson was amazing. He came alone, no press, no photographer. He spent hours signing autographs, talking to firemen, policemen, iron workers, shaking hands, and raising morale. I took him through the command center to Pier 92 and made sure he met Calvin Drayton, one of the guys who was a huge fan and had passed out at the Forward Command Center that I talked about earlier. He was back at work after collapsing at the Forward Command Center. I took Reggie to the children's area at Pier 94, but did not go in with him. I had reached my limit, but he kept going. Lessons learned. Know your limitations. I do not regret that decision. I would not have been any good to anybody after going into the Children's Center. It's okay to say, done. Right? I just waited for an hour. He came out. We just went on. We brought 42 senators to Ground Zero. I escorted Senator Clinton, Senator Snowe, and Senator Landrieu. They were amazing. I wish all Americans could see their senators on that day. Kind, caring, articulate people everyone could be proud of. I saw courage I will never fathom in men like Chief Brown. Chief Brown survived the Pentagon attacks because he was lucky enough not to be at his desk. He called home to tell his wife he had survived, and his wife told him their son was on the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. I picked up Chief Brown. I picked up Chief Brown at Pennsylvania Station in New York City. He had come to New York to eulogize a young man who had worked for him in the Pentagon, Petty Officer Michael Noeth, who had been killed in the attacks. After losing his own son, he stood up in front of Petty Officer Noeth's mother and grandmother and talked of their loss. He went to Ground Zero with me and then back to Penn Station. I sat in Penn Station having a beer while waiting for the train to take him back to D.C. I asked him how he was managing. He told me he just thinks about what he has to be thankful for every day. Lesson learned. Events like this stay with you for the rest of your life, and new information and insights appear. Just the other day, I sent Gail my article, and she read the article, and she came up to me and said, Petty Officer Noeth used to hang out here at NHHC with a combat artist, and that his dream was to become a combat artist. And, prayer service. It was an honor to help the deputy mayor with the prayer service for the families in Yankee Stadium. It was great to see how great President Clinton was in his support for the prayer service. About the great speech Admiral Natter delivered in Yankee Stadium to open the prayer service, about the flag the governor and mayor gave Admiral Natter that day, which was sent to the USS Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier, named after a New Yorker, to be flown as her planes attacked Afghanistan. That's a picture of the actual flag on the Roosevelt. About watching Bette Midler pull herself together, sing an amazing version of Wings Beneath Your Wings, honoring all who had fallen, and then once out of the public view, just break down in tears. I'd never seen such strength. The flag given Admiral Natter was a flag from Ground Zero. The Ground Zero flag disappeared for years and was returned around 2013 and is now at the World Trade Center Museum. The flag that we hung from the World Financial Center was destroyed. An employee claimed that they had hung the flag, and Merrill Lynch, or one of those companies, it's a blur now, and I couldn't find Matt's email, but Matt emailed me what had happened. He's in a car going to LaGuardia with the CEO, I think it was Merrill Lynch, who bragged about his employee who went home and hung this huge flag on the building and raised morale, and Matt's like, no, we did that. That was the City Hall flag. And before they got to LaGuardia, the CEO was on his phone, and that employee was fired. But what they found out was he sold chunks of the flag on eBay until it was all gone. So there is no flag that we hung. Anyway, so I escorted Admiral Bilal to Ground Zero. His office was destroyed on 9/11 in the Pentagon. He looked right at the fireman and said, quote, "The Pentagon was a tragedy, but I've never seen anything like this." Or taking Admiral Morgan, the USS Enterprise Battle Group commander, and the first to strike back at Afghanistan to Ground Zero, and having him surrounded by cops and firemen who wanted to meet the guy that shot back, and then working to have him speak to standing room only at one police plaza on December 7th, 2001. What they wanted was pictures of the Enterprise and what he was doing, so he sent me hundreds of these USS Enterprise salutes, NYPD and FDNY, and there's a World Trade Center superimposed on the flight deck and some of the operations going on. He sent me hundreds of these, and we went on on Christmas Eve to Ground Zero, to the police headquarters there, and handed those out. It meant a lot to them. XO USS Cole. I wish I had time to go into what a huge help Commander Chris Peterschmidt, the executive officer of USS Cole, was. He came to New York to assist. His advice and counsel was fantastic, and his push to get everyone to just return to normal and get some sort of pace that was achievable setup was great. President Bush in the first pitch, if you saw ESPN 30 on 30, how great it felt to be in Yankee Stadium watching the president throw out the first pitch as Navy jets did a flyover. Now, maybe not a good idea to do a flyover after 9/11. First it was, and then when they realized it was, they literally had to announce in the stadium that it was Navy jets. And then people were like, oh, okay. Alma Nader came up for that game. We were all in George Steinbrenner's box. I had an opportunity to ask to him, just no one in between me and him, if he wanted to move forward with the commissioning of the USS Bulkley. He said yes. He said, quote, "We need to return to normal." I was like, oh, that's a theme I've heard a lot of, right? I called and let Commander Del Toro know, now, the SecNav. I went home and read Walt Whitman, quote, "Baseball will take our people out of doors, fill them with oxygen, give them a large physical stoicism, tend to relieve us from being a nervous, dyspeptic set. Repair those losses and be a blessing to us," Walt Whitman. I did a lot of group therapy at Yankee Stadium until the Arizona Diamondbacks ruined everything and won the World Series. Lessons learned: your city should never lose the World Series after a disaster. So, also Clarice, Deputy Director, Veterans Affairs, stocky African-American woman from Queens, just unflappable. We're in Steinbrenner's box, and Steinbrenner says, "Are you enjoying yourself?" And she says, "This is my first Yankee game." He goes, "How's that possible?" She says, "I'm a Mets fan." He was speechless. I just turned and walked away. She denies it. I'm like, I was right there. I saw it. So, USS Bulkley and Fleet Week. We kept working on, kept moving on. We commissioned the USS Bulkley in New York City on December 6, 2001, as scheduled, with more than 6,000 people in attendance. We held Fleet Week in New York in May 2002 to record crowds. During Fleet Week, Clarice and I had worked with HBO to premiere HBO's documentary In Memoriam at the Grand Hyatt in front of 600 first responders and 600 sailors, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen just back from the war in Afghanistan, or who were involved in 9/11. Ironically, the year before, we had filled a theater in Times Square for the showing of Pearl Harbor. It sounded like a great idea, and then we saw how rough the documentary was, and it's brutal to watch it, and we thought, we've just created a horrible event where people freak out from PTSD. We literally found ministers, chaplains, rabbis, commanding officers of ships during Fleet Week to sit at every table. We were so concerned that we had set up ourselves for a disaster. But what happened was all these grizzly old firemen and cops and stuff just took all these sailors and Marines and Coast Guardsmen under their wing, and they just all went out and had a really good time in Manhattan. I'm sure no one paid for anything. So, so it worked. This was the documentary. So, the night before the public closing of Ground Zero, which occurred during Fleet Week 2002, hundreds of sailors, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen lined the routes from the base of Ground Zero to street level, up that huge ramp. And each fireman, policeman, and iron worker were handed an American flag as they left Ground Zero for the last time. It was one of those things that just happened at the last minute, and was one of the greatest signs of respect and admiration I've ever witnessed. I was standing with FDNY Chief Sal Casano, a Vietnam veteran, and we watched a Marine who looked like he was 16 hand a flag to an old fireman. And I said, "Sal, were we ever that young?" He said, "No." Then I learned that one of my reserve officers working Fleet Week, his brother-in-law was Lieutenant Commander Thomas McGinnis, one of the American airline pilots. Flight 11 pilots. the first to hit the Twin Towers. And there he is at the Twin Towers handing out flags. So they called up and said, we have 1,100 flags that we want to give out. Do you know how to fold one? I'm like, when? They're like, tonight. I'm like, who do you think is going to fold 1,100 flags between now and tonight? And it was like the fastest recall in Fleet Week history. They just put the word out. If you want to volunteer to do this, come down to Battery Park. We were swamped with kids from the ships during Fleet Week. They folded every one of these things and they handed every one of them out. USS New York, Clarice Joins called me and asked me to put her in touch with the Secretary of the Navy. The city wanted USS New York made from World Trade Center steel. I put her in touch with the Secretary's Public Affairs Officer, Kevin Wensing. Today, there are tons of World Trade Center steel in the USS New York. Take care of yourself. Shortly after 9/11, Mike Handy, Director of Veterans Affairs, New York City, John Hartman, Army Corps of Engineers, and Richie Shear, Director of Office of Emergency Management, died of heart attacks. I think they literally worked themselves to death. That is possible. So again, take care of yourself, pace yourself, know your limits. Recently, I signed papers for Warrant Officer Frank Indovino's family, stating he was working with me at Ground Zero at 9/11 after he died of a cancer-related 9/11 cancer. Captain Bob Ski from the White House, who came to TSA, recently passed away. He spent too much time at the Pentagon, I think, even though he was the White House Coast Guard liaison. It is not over when the public thinks it's over. It's maybe never over for some people. So you need to be vigilant, you need to take care of yourself, and you need to surround yourself in an environment that gets it. I read a New York Times article about 10 years ago that said, on the 10th anniversary, all the tough guys who didn't go for help were crashing and going for help. And I said, oh, I'm just a great big stereotype. Good to know that I'm no different than all the other tough guys that thought they didn't need help. So Tim Burns, I took my brother, Tim, to Ground Zero shortly after 9/11. It was a cold, miserable, rainy day. We stood reading the board. They had put a giant board up of all 3,000 names of those who were murdered in the attack. He would occasionally say things like, he worked for me, or that was one of our young guys who interned for us. This was his time, and I just stayed silent. And we walked past the name board and into the pit. We just stood there looking around, knowing how fortunate we both were to be there. So thank you for listening to my remembrances. I found this last night. Hey, you want to help me unfold this? I even forgot I had this. This was sent down from Northeast Region, Subgroup 2, and hung in the command center. You know, and what we need is another sheet full of... But I totally forgot I had this. Here, I'll swing around this way. But this was really nice. This is really helpful. So we had our Navy desk, and it's upside down. Anyways, Subgroup 2, Northeast Region, and all the front office staff signed this and sent it down. People were just doing amazing things. So anyway, any questions? Do we Q&A? Or anyway, we have 6 minutes. Happy to take questions. Yes?
You want to talk more about Admiral Dennis and the team that he created after 9/11? You were a member of it.
Yeah, we were asked to come down and help stand up Homeland Security. And the first year was amazing. Admiral Loy from former Commandant of the Coast Guard, Naval Bennis, a lot of people in New York came down. And I thought it was going very well, and then Naval Bennis resigned, and Naval Bennis died, and Naval Lloyd resigned, and it became the wild, wild west. But that was one of the legacies. That's how I ended up in Washington. The deal was I'd stay here for a year and then go to Harvard to the JFK school. But nobody remembered that deal after Emma Lloyd left and Emma Bennis died. So here I am. Happy to be here with all of you. Any other questions? People give you, I didn't even realize I had, people just give you stuff. They like walk up. Some young lieutenant, I don't even know who it was anymore. He just gave me this shattered piece of World Trade Center glass. You know, it's supposed to be hurricane-proof glass. It's probably covered with all sorts of toxins, so we'll just leave that in there. But, you know, that's what's raining down on you at the World Financial Center. Yeah. Any other questions? I will just leave you with this. If you think you'll never forget, you will. Write down your remembrances. You'll thank me later. I run into people, there's things I completely forgot, and now I've gotten to the habit of writing it down. If you don't, I think you're doing yourself and maybe the world a big disservice. So take the time, write these things down. Whether it was 9/11, whether you deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, whatever, write it down, because you'll forget. You know, I literally had to call another Coast Guard friend, Mark Johnson, to get Bob's full name for this presentation. The guy calls me from the White House Situation Room 20 years later. I don't remember his name. Remember his face. I had to call somebody to make sure I had it right. You know, why is the White House Situation Room calling me? Because Air Force One is still in the air, and the White House Situation Room really wasn't the center of everything, so they're still trying to figure out what's going on too. So he's leaving the Situation Room, going outside, and calling me. What's the Navy doing? That's kind of scary. But again, the Situation Room is where the president is, right? And the president was on Air Force One, so. But again, I'll leave you with that. Please write things down. Don't take things for granted. Take care of yourself. And on 9/11, just think about it for a little bit. And how nice everybody was to each other after 9/11. How the country came together. What happened the last 20 years? You know, everybody's at each other's throats. I mean, crime in New York City went to almost zero for 3 months. I mean, it was mind-boggling how people responded to that. You know, there was an assault in Central Park. 3 guys ran down, grabbed the guy. I think they probably beat the crap out of him, held him till the police showed up. You know, I don't see that happening today. So think about, you know, how we treated each other after 9/11, not just the tragedy. On that, time is up. Thank you very much.